Follow these tips and you too can learn how to sing Alice in Chains classics like this.
Scaries on the wall. Scaries on his way. Oh, watch where you step. I'd advise you wait until it's over. Oh, then you got hit. And you should have known better. And we die young. Faster we run.
Hey everybody, it's Matthew. Welcome back. Today we are going to do something a little bit different. We're going to do a vocal lesson today. And I'm going to teach you guys just a few different techniques here to help you sing in that Layne Staley Alice in Chains style. And before we get into that, of course, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so that you can see when new videos are out and keep updated on everything that's going on around here. I would appreciate it very much if you did that. Thanks a lot. But anyway, getting into this, let's get into the basics here, which is using nasality in your singing to help add some brightness and add a little bit of sheen to it. So Layne is a pretty forward singer. He does use a lot of nasality, which may surprise some people based on how he sings some things, but he is a very nasal singer. And so we're going to be using this area of our face here. So they call this the mask. It's kind of this area from your nose to here on your upper lip, and this part of your cheeks kind of makes a triangle from the top of your nose down, is basically how to think about that. And so to get bright and use that, we want to do sounds like this: E, I, O, U, I, E, and the E sound is really where you're going to get the most out of this. And if you have done that right, you should feel that entire region of your face vibrating with the sound, as opposed to this sound, which is much less nasal. We don't want that. We want this. That's very important to get that sound. So go ahead and make a bunch of E sounds or whatever you want to do. Try other vowels too and see how those respond to that particular area of your mouth and your nose. Anyway, next part we're going to talk about is getting the soft palate involved and getting that signature sound that is so ubiquitous with Layne's vocals. So what you're physically doing is you're dropping your soft palate, which is in the back of your mouth, to make that sound, but that's weird technical stuff that you don't really know. So the way we're going to do this is we're going to make an sound. We're going to go while keeping that same nasality that we've talked about before. So we're going to go I, U, O. So you want and you should feel that get a little bit back in your mouth. You should feel more vibration towards the back if you're doing this right, and as opposed to going it moves it back a little bit, but we of course can still use the resonance in the rest of our mouth to project that sound forward to make a more pleasing and more robust sound. So doing those things, we get lines like this in It Ain't Like That. So the opening verse. There I was laid out on a table. Okay, that should be okay. I need to just back up a little bit, I think, for what I'm singing. But you get the idea. Hopefully that line was okay. I get a little bit nervous when I'm recording and doing vocals. So it kind of messes me up sometimes, but hopefully that was fine. But you heard what I was doing. So for like there, it's like that, that sound. There I was. See, we get a little bit more open there. We're removing some of that nasality. And then lay. See, back to that sound again. Lay. That's one of our soft palate things there, and he does that a lot. And that's kind of the idea with the resonance. And then when we get to table, it's table. Like that. So he's kind of going back and forth between this forward nasality and then backing it up by using the soft palate like we've talked about to get those usual sounds. And of course, doing compression of your voice the entire time with your body, which is you push hard using the muscles that you use to go to the bathroom, basically. That's the best way to put it. So your lower abs and then the muscles down there, and you get a sound more like this as opposed to if we were not compressing. And you're doing that for most of your lines with Layne. He is a very hard compressor, which is something you don't necessarily hear. A lot of, because of how he was mixed, is a little bit odd, and the effect and things on his voice makes you think he's less intense than he is, but that's really not what's happening. So again, the line would be, there I was laid out on a table. So like that. And going to the compression, we're going to talk about Layne's lows here for a little bit. And when he's in the lower register of his voice, he's compressing very hard down there too. And it's less noticeable because your voice does not distort typically in a lower register. When you compress really hard, it takes a lot more to get it to do that down there. So doing a typical amount of compression, less noticeable in lows. Keeping that in mind, when we're on lows with Layne, we usually want to be really intense. So if we go to the next part of the verse of It Ain't Like That, it would be like this. In my life, I'd not soften things that cut and burn so often, but I sit, think of something, scared to face the dying nothing. And don't be afraid to be extremely dynamic with your mouth when you're doing stuff like that, because Layne is typically pretty dynamic with his vowels, opening, closing them, doing all kinds of different weird things with your face to make it sound as weird as possible. I say weird, but the Alice in Chains vibe. There's kind of a little bit of a creep factor with it, and a lot of that is just really being dynamic with your voice with that lowered soft palate. So you have things like that, of course. Now we go up with Layne's voice into the higher register. So we're doing the same things up in higher parts of our voice when we get there. So like the chorus in It Ain't Like That, when we get to that, you'll see what I mean. We're still doing similar things. We still got some of that lowered soft palate. We still got that forward nasality present a little bit, which it does go away a little bit in his mixed voice when he really belts. Some of that nasality goes back and you have a little bit more open sound, because that's kind of naturally what will happen, and it's also how you project your voice a little better. So still compressing hard and doing all those things. So see the cycle I waited for. It's typical things when you're doing the C. That's very back soft palate. C. Hopefully I get that right. It's kind of tough for me. Again, sitting down's a little bit harder for me to get these belts out, but this is the appropriate camera angle for this. But anyway, the idea we're talking about there, so that's back and then when we get to the cycle, it's very open there. We're moving that sound forward a bit more. Sigh. So as you can see there, sometimes you need a little bit more airflow than that to get it up there. Of course, I have a disability with that, so I'm a little bit weaker down in my core and things like that, so I can't quite generate the SPL that some of these other singers do, which SPL is just the natural loudness. It's the physical ability for you to move air. Basically, it is a way they measure loudness with decibels. There's different ways to measure that depending on what kind of source you're dealing with. But the voice is typically SPL. Of course, if you have more SPL, you will get a fuller, better sound when you go to belt and compress your voice and things like that. But as we heard there, he goes to that big I sound with cycle, sigh. Don't have to open your mouth super wide necessarily. That's whatever you feel is comfortable for that. But when we get to Cole, it's got that, he closes the sound down a little bit and makes it darker. And there's a little bit of vibrato, and then you open back up for I've waited for. I waited for. Which brings us to the other things of his vowels. For. He does a lot of that. Ow, ow. A lot of opening vowels, closing them back down. A, A is going to that U or O sound, or having a more open vowel, far, and going into more of an E or S kind of sound. He does a lot of that kind of vowel manipulation typically with his singing. So that's a very important thing to remember with that. Keeping that in mind with closing vowels down, he does a little bit of the R sound, the that made Eddie Vedder and Scott Stapp a little bit more infamous. Of course, Layne was the first one to start doing that, but he's very particular with it. A lot of times he'll just have a word and he'll just curl his tongue back a little bit to make that sound a little darker and close, which doesn't always give you that noticeable sound. It's a little more subtle. And so with things like, Rooster, with the opening line of that, ain't found a way to kill me yet. See, so you hear that it's a little bit darker and it has that tongue curled back kind of sound, but there's not an R sound. So he's very careful about how he uses that. Typically, it will be on the ends of phrases and words, where he'll just have that quick little in the back there, but you won't necessarily quite hear the R sound. So that's a very particular thing to remember with that. Yet. I'll do it a little bit longer so you guys get it. Yet. And it's just slightly curling your tongue, the tip of your tongue backwards is how you get that bit of a sound. And you can manipulate that to varying degrees. Yeah. Which don't go that far back because you sound like an idiot if you do that. But same idea applies there with things like that. Very important thing. Now, there are times where it's more noticeable, like in, Love, Hate, Love. I tried to love you. I thought I would. I tried to own you. I thought I could. See, he does that. It's more noticeable in the live version, I think. But he goes could when he starts closing the vowel on could. It's could. You hear that very slightly happening there. And of course, tasteful vibrato on the ends of notes. Layne will do that to varying degrees all the time. And you can hear that if you pay attention. Like the part I did there, he does vibrato a lot on that. And again, very particular with that. He doesn't always do it. It really depends. He likes to do it low in his voice and on like O's and U's typically. So that seems to be his preference for where he uses vibrato, but he will use it higher up in his voice too. And of course, there's an important thing to note about the quality of, your compression at the top of your voice, like when you're doing a lot of the big choruses. Don't be so worried about the texture of your distortion or how you think it sounds to you, or if it's loud enough or things like that. If you do that, you will get bogged down in those details and not be able to execute it. So regardless of how it sounds to you in your head, like it could sound weak, to me, at first when I was doing some of those techniques, with Layne's voice and doing choruses that were really high and things like that. Like doing this one, for example, I used to think my distortion sounded weak or thin, but of course you record it properly and do the right things. It's not going to sound that way. It's going to sound fine when you do it. It took me a bit to figure that out, but I'm less concerned now about the loudness or how I perceive that distortion to be for myself. So, don't get hung up on that and you'll be all right. And of course, we did touch on the resonance a little bit earlier, like I said, with the low stuff, him being more intense with his compression and things like that. There's some differences with his projection of his voice and things like that, which some of that I think has to do with the mixing of his voice. He seems to rely a lot more on that projection later in his career than the power and things like that. Projection of your voice and resonance is very important, because it can make you seem louder, and it's also typically a more pleasing sound. So of course you could really try to push something out, but if you don't have that proper resonance and things like that, it's not going to be as good as it could be. You might sound a little wimpy. And one thing I forgot to mention is the use of vocal fry. This sound which you can get to by lowering your voice as low as it can go, like this. And it'll naturally give you that sound. And you can move it around, of course. So up in that range, of course. Now, this does come through a little bit in Layne's voice. Fry is a funky thing where it can show itself at different spots in your voice on its own without you really trying to do it. Depending on where in your range you're compressing your voice, it can come out. You can do both at once, compression and fry, and that does happen to some degree with Layne, and I don't think he's necessarily thinking about that. It's kind of just comes out a little bit, although there are songs where he does fry a little bit harder, but I think that's just for the mood of the song, So here's an example, though, of what I was talking about earlier with the difference between using resonance and those things and not. In this example, he's using a lot more fry and things like that and pushing into that than he is the resonance. So I Know Something About You from Facelift starts like this. Oh, why can't I take it all okay? Hopefully that was correct rhythm. And then the second line, I like to dig and fuck around with your day. There's a little bit more fry there. And then next line, I'm gonna tell your mama, yeah, I'm gonna blackball your name. You get that idea. So let's jump, though, out a little bit here to Nutshell, and you're gonna see what I mean with the resonance, because of course he does, instead of relying on his fry and things like that, he compresses this pretty tough and really relies on the natural resonance of his face and the vowels that he's singing. So of course, Nutshell, we chase misprinted lines, we face the path of time, and yet I fight this battle all alone. No one to cry to, no place to call home. So it's a lot of sitting on those open vowels and doing those kind of things. He's very resonant here. It's not so much about the fry. It's about the lyrics, about the quality of the vowel and the resonance of it. So that's kind of the style differences there. And it does depend on the song content a lot of the times. He'll rely more on this style for, the more emotional, softer songs. And then we'll go back to a more fry heavy, kind of just blasting it out style for some of the faster paced, higher energy kind of songs. let's recap what we did here. First thing, nasality, and then lowered soft palate, tastefully opening that up when we need to, compression, keep that compression throughout your range in different places. Don't worry about the distortion lower in your voice. Rely on the resonance down there and those things like that. And when you get higher, you can rely on the fry a little bit more, but we're always compressing pretty hard. We want that clean compressed sound. Not clean, but we want that compressed sound. And then, of course, vowel manipulation. Being very dynamic with that. Closing your vowels down with the dark sound. Using your resonance and relying on that when appropriate. Using the natural resonance and compression to help with your projection in your sound. That kind of thing there. And you do all those things together and you will get to the Layne Staley technique. Not the tone. You will not match his tone. That is impossible to do. Not because he's legendary, because of course he is, but it's impossible because you are a different person than he is. You can learn all the techniques and all the things, and you may not sound like that person even when you do it. You can hear in my examples, I don't, even though I understand very well his technique. But you're different. You have a different timbre. You have a different physiology to your vocal tract and all those different things that are contributing to your tone, so you won't quite sound like that, but you can get close and you can sing Alice in Chains songs really well by following these techniques. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Of course, don't forget to like and subscribe and hit the bell so that you know when new videos are out. Leave a comment down below if you want more vocal type of videos like this. Please let me know. And if you want me to cover more Alice in Chains songs, you can drop those down below too if you want to. Why not? And I'll see you guys next time for another video. Have a good one.